Howdy folks, it's Adriel the Hunting Gear Guy, and this is a Norinco JW20. It's a copy of the Browning SA22, and that stands for semi-automatic 22. It's so old that Browning, they just called it their semi-auto. I believe the Browning one dates back to 1914, somewhere around in there. This particular Norinco one, I believe this was made in the 90s sometime because just from, the smell of that oil, but mostly the manual is just a very 90s style to it. So I think this is a new old stock rifle that was made for the US market in the mid-90s, but again, in the mid-90s, 94, 95, somewhere around there, Chinese arms were banned from import into the US. So none of them got in. I'd imagine they stayed in a warehouse somewhere. They might have just kept pumping them out and maybe stopped eventually. And they just waited for the Americans to repeal that ban, and they never did. So now these firearms are showing up in countries like Canada and Australia and all over the place because they're actually pretty cool. These are really interesting rifles. I've actually had one of the Browning versions, and they're really interesting little rifles. They feed in new rounds through the butt here. You need to pull out this magazine tube. Magazine tube? Yeah, magazine tube. We pop our rounds in there. You know you've got too many when they start sticking out. Then you got to shake out that last one. So they actually hold 11 rounds. Then you pop in that magazine tube. Charge the rifle on the bottom using this charging handle. And the rifle's ready to fire. So empties eject downwards and they feed new rounds in through the top. Now the cool thing about this rifle isn't only that it's a super neat form factor, it's also a takedown rifle. So I can push this little button to the top, and this one's pretty stiff because again it's Chinese manufacturer. It's a little bit rough, but you can work this in, or you can. I'll show you a couple parts that you could Dremel to make this a little bit smoother. So I've got that lever forward. Now I can pull the bolt back and I can twist this. Now when you twist this, don't twist with the wood. If you notice up here, the connection between the metal and the wood is pretty thin, and that is a fragile point on these things. So always make sure you're twisting with the receiver and twist it about halfway, and then it comes apart. So this is a Takedown 22. Actually, the big reason why I got this is I did the Savage 64 Takedown 22 video, and I said, this is the cheapest Takedown 22. And someone said, actually, you're wrong. We've got these things. And they are cheaper than the Savage 64 Takedown. So, and they're in some ways kind of cooler, right? If you just want to run an iron sight rifle with a very cool way of holding the rounds there and no mag sticking out, this is a neat little gun for that. To reassemble, all we do is line up those interrupted lugs that we've got on there, line them up and down, put it in, pull our bolt back just a little bit, and then twist it into position. Now I'm going to have to show you guys this. I twist it until that knob is about in the middle, and then I can push it down to lock it in place, and now it won't move. Now, starting at the back of the rifle, this is where we see that magazine tube. This thing is just free rotating, so I could rotate it to be sideways or up or down. It doesn't really matter. To take it out, I'm going to need to be at right that angle right there, and then it comes out. Now, on the Browning one, it stopped at some point, and you couldn't pull it out anymore, and that was for a good reason, because you don't need to pull it down anymore. To feed rounds in, you'll need to have this thing at a fairly vertical angle, and then you can drop rounds in there nose first and load it up. This thing does actually come all the way up, and then you get the floppy noodle thing going on, and you can see the back there. If your rifle comes and it's a little bit loose between the wood and the metal, take a coin and just tighten right there. Tighten that up, and that'll tighten up the connection between these two. Again, not too tight because this stuff is pretty thin. I'm just going to go ahead and put my floppy noodle back in the gun. Find where those lugs are and then turn it in. Now moving forward here, we've got a trigger. Standard crossbolt safety, just where you'd expect it to be. It's a little bit smaller on the left-hand side where you're putting on the safety. It's got a little bit of a textured side on the other side. Now, the original Browning versions had a lot of scroll work on them, and you can see this one's got a bit of scroll work on the side as well, just because otherwise it would be really boring just to have a slab of metal on the side of this thing. One of the interesting things about these rifles, because they've got such a small receiver here, it's actually like you've got a lot of room to grab around the receiver, and that's the balance point. You can easily hold this rifle just like that. Fantastic for carrying around the woods, just like that, which is a real plus. The sights on this thing, it's using a sliding little chunk of metal at the back here that you can slide up or down to get elevation on this thing. I found that mine needed to be just a little bit off the bottom, so a little bit up. So I do have some range in my sights. The front post is it's got a little bit of a brass dot on there, so it's easy to see. One of the things that you'll have to remember, because it's got that sliding metal on the back here, the rear sight, you can't use the top blade. You need to use the bottom blade as your sight reference. So that's a little bit interesting, but it's one of the cheaper ways to do these sliding plate style sights. Now, up towards the middle here, we have this tightener. This tightens the connection between the two. I'm going to show you how to do this the proper way, because I saw a couple of videos of people doing this the wrong way, and it really confused me for a little while. So I'll show you that in a minute. We've got a nice wide forend here that comes off with just a simple screw here. So it fills the hand really nicely. They could have made this a lot thinner, I guess, but they wanted to kind of go for the traditional Browning look. So it's a bit of a fatter hand guard there. Hand guard? Forend? Whatever. And then we have another interesting thing. And again, I think this is a sign that this was made for the US market. In Canada, we aren't allowed to have suppressors because they're too cool and fun. But it has a threaded muzzle here. So we've got a muzzle thread protector here. When I first screwed this off, I thought it had detents on it. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. They weren't detents. It was just really ugly machining on here. But who cares? I mean, like for me, I'm just going to leave this thing on there and just leave it permanently. And you can see there we've got just a standard crown on it. So let me talk about the takedown adjustment here and why some of the other guys will have it wrong on there. So let me just take that out, pop it off. Now, some of the guys were loosening this one, putting the rifle together, and then tightening it up. Now, if you do that, you'll never get that connection tight. Now, I'll show you an example here. So let me just loosen that right off. I'll put it together. Okay, went together very easily there. And now let's tighten this barrel nut on all the way, as much as we can. And we have a ton of movement. You can't tighten this thing when these two are together. Actually, what you need to do is kind of experiment a little bit, tighten a little bit, try it on. Oh, too tight. Loosen it a bit. Try it on. Oh, I went the wrong way. Let's try that again. Oh, too much. Let's go a couple more. And that is about where I was before. Maybe one too tight. So I'm just going to click that one out. There we go. Now it's going to be perfect. You only have to do this once, right? You don't have to do this process a million times. There we go. Now it's indexing. It's got a nice snug fit in there. I can still get that detent in, and no wobble. No up and down wobble with this thing. So check that when you get yours from the factory. Now, speaking of getting it from the factory, if you get one of these things, it's going to be coated in oil because it was made in the 90s. And they had to preserve them. So they smoked a bunch of oil over top of them, which is a good thing because these are extremely well preserved. You won't find any rust on the outside of it. I found a couple of parts on the inside with a little bit of rust on them, but not enough to really care about it. So I'm just going to take my upper and lower off. I'm going to start with disassembling the upper. You're going to have to take everything apart because it's going to be coated in oil and you're going to need to clean all the parts off There is a flathead screw there. Get a nice fitting screwdriver in there, and try not to get it off kilter, because you will mark up that that flat screwdriver bit on there. Screw. And you don't want that to happen. You don't want to make your gun uglier than it needs to be just because you used the wrong bit on there. Once that's loose, you can pull that screw out, and the fore end will come off. Now that fore end had an important job in holding this part together. We can actually slowly pull this out. Now there's going to be a spring here that's holding against these teeth here, and it's going to want to spring down after this. If you're worried about this, don't do this in a room where there's a bunch of like weird places where the spring can go. Some guys like to put this in a baggie and then take it apart, and then all the little parts will stay in there. I am feeling lucky, so I'm not going to do that. Ooh, I don't know if it's going to go. Oh, I see the spring. That spring has loosened. You can see it right there, and now I can pull this piece right off. And this nut will now just screw right off. I'm not going to bother because it doesn't really matter. So there's another hidden spring in this thing. It's going to want to get shot out that way. So as I push this guy up, I'm going to cover just underneath it. Sorry, I can't show this super well to you guys because I just don't want that spring to fly out. There we go. So I held it in place. This guy comes off the top, and there's that spring and detent. Now, if you want that lock to operate a little bit smoother, what I would recommend is getting some buffing compound and just buffing in here a little bit. There's a transition between the divot in there to this flat spot up there. That's where this pin is going to ride, and that's what's going to cause the resistance in moving this thing up and down. So if you're going to be taking it down a lot, and you just smooth that out a little bit, it would just make the rifle a lot nicer to use. Now to put it back together, what we're going to need to do is push this down, and we need that pin there, that detent in there. So I'm just going to grab a screwdriver here, and I'm going to push down on that detent. Again, this is where some eye protection or doing this in a baggie might be recommended, depending on how comfortable you are with this kind of stuff. So there we have it back on. The next part is our other little spring and detent. It goes in a hole right there. So we're going to just pop that right in there. And then that whole ring is going to fit on here. Now, you see that detent in there? We're going to have to get that up and over onto this metal ring at some point. And this is where a dental pick is going to be handy. I'm going to have to do this without you guys seeing it just because, well, maybe you can see it. I don't know. All right, so I almost have it in position. I just need to pick it over just a little bit more. And now it's back on there. Now, of course, before putting this all back together, de-oil, get all the factory oil off of this thing, and then re-oil it with hops or something like that. Next, I'm going to pop my fore end back on, get that screw in there, and screw it back in. I think one of the coolest parts about this rifle is the receiver and how it's put together. A lot of 22s these days have a much larger receiver. This is very small and very compact. I think it just speaks to some of the genius in how they packed so much into such a small receiver. To take it down, no tools required. All we need to do is push forward on this trigger guard. It'll go up, and then we can actually pull it right out of there, just like that, just by rotating it. And then it'll just come out. So it's got a couple of grooves on there that mate with parts of the inner receiver. Now the actual inner receiver, not much going on. We've got, you can see that little dingus coming out of there. That's the follower. And there's a couple of other things in there. I'm not actually going to clean those or get to them. I would recommend getting the oil out of there because you don't want a lot of that packing oil in there. But check this out. Check out this tiny little operating package that is the bolt, the recoil spring, the trigger pack, the whole shebang in such a small package. And the bolt, that's it. That's all the cycle there is to it. And the hammer, and it's all right here. And you can see as we pull the trigger, what that's doing is letting that claw off of the striker there. And as you pull it, it will let the striker go forward. So that's it. That's all there is to this thing. So reload, all it does is let that claw grab back onto that shelf there. Now, the machine work on this thing is rough. I think it's fairly rough, but it works. It works, and it's such a good copy of this Browning SA22. Now, a couple of places where you might want to work it over a little bit. I found that the rails down here were very sharp, and hitting those with a file would be nicer on your fingers as you're dragging them across to charge the rifle. And then some of the internal parts here, again, a little polish work on it wouldn't hurt at all. Now to pull this thing apart, very simple. We're going to strike it out, and then we're going to take the bolt and charging handle and the whole thing. We're going to take it apart. There's going to be some springs that are going to fly. And that's it. So there's our bolt. Very simple construction to it. You can see our firing pin coming out the back. So there's our firing pin. Super easy setup there. And we have our recoil and striker springs just held on the back there. Now to reassemble, we'll need to take our striker spring, our recoil spring, get them roughly in place. Take our recoil spring, stuff it into that side deal there. Now, if you have three hands, that would be ideal here. So if you have someone to help you put this back together, that would help speed things up. If you don't, just keep at it. Get those springs in the right spot. This rear recoil spring here is kind of cagey. It kind of wants to spring out on its own, but you can finagle them in there fairly easily. Just to hold this together better, I would recommend racking the bolt so that striker is held, and then putting the safety on. Next, to put it back into the receiver, I can't remember how I did this last time. I'm just going to put the bolt in there and kind of pull forward on the trigger group and then pull it down, and oh, I did it. Oh, cool. Okay. That was easy. Now, if I wanted to pull this down a little bit further, I could pull the receiver off of the stock by loosening that nut at the back. I'm not going to bother doing that for you guys on camera because there's not really a lot of oil that you need to clean out of there, so it's not really necessary when you first get the rifle. What kind of accessories can you get for this rifle? Well, none. I mean, well, there is. You can get a barrel Picatinny mount to mount a scope on this thing. I would really recommend not putting a scope on this thing just because the irons are good enough. And for the compactness of this thing, it really is very nice carrying around in the woods with that center receiver carry or over the shoulder or whatever thing you want to do. And I think putting a scope on this thing is at least it's not something I would do. Maybe you would do it, but just not doing it for me. I do think this rifle is fantastic for heading out into the woods, going shooting rabbits and that kind of thing, because it's so carryable. It just feels like it was meant for the woods. Very nice and compact. Very nice to shoot out and plink on rocks or go hunting small game. And I think that's where this rifle, especially for the price point, really shines. Thanks for watching.